Well, good morning and welcome to this chapel that opens the Ravi Zacharias International Ministries lectureship here at Trinity International University. And if you are a guest from on campus with us today, we want to especially welcome you here. Well, our speaker this morning, Dr. Oz Guinness, is an internationally known author, social critic, senior fellow at the East-West Institute in New York, and an associate with RZIM. He was born in China. He's a child of missionary parents, witnessed the communist takeover in China, and experienced a few adventures there, I found out last night as a small child. He holds a Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford University. He's been a guest scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Studies, a guest scholar and visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Guinness has written and edited more than 25 books, and his latest is The Last Christian on Earth. There are probably few Christian social commentators with his wisdom, with his grace, and with his prophetic insight. His topic for this morning is, Can Freedom Last Forever? The Founder's Forgotten Question, and How Are We Doing Today? Will you welcome back to Trinity this morning, Dr. Oz Guinness.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you all. It's a tremendous pleasure to be back. Last year was both stimulating and heartwarming, and I trust this time will be too. And I appreciate the improved weather you had this time. Delightful. Thoroughly English weather, of course. I want to speak about two topics in terms of engaging culture, but both of them have a strong apologetic dimension. The first one, can freedom last forever? You won't hear this topic raised in the presidential election, but I suggest to you that it lies under many of the debates that we're having today. In 1843, a young Massachusetts scholar, 21, was doing some research on the last surviving veterans of the Revolutionary War. And he met an old gentleman who was 70 years older than him, Captain Levi Preston. And Preston had fought both in Concord and Lexington. And nervously, the student said to him, "Well, why did you go out to fight?" And the old boy was rather stunned at such an obvious question and didn't say anything, just raised himself painfully up to his full height. And the researcher said, "Well, of course, you went out to fight oppressions." "We weren't oppressed," said the old boy. "Well, what about the Stamp Act?" "Didn't pay a penny for one of them," he said. "Well, how about the tea tax?" "Never drank a drop of it," he said. "The boys threw it in the harbor before we got there." "Well, what about the great books on freedom you must have read, Locke and Harrington and Sidney?" "Never heard of them," he said. "The only books we had were the Bible, Isaac Watts' hymn book, and an almanac." By this time, the researcher was getting a little nonplussed, and he said eventually, "Well, why did you go out to fight?" And the old boy gave this immortal answer: "We had always been free, and we intended to be free always, and the redcoats were in our way." Just think of that phrase, always free, free always. Now, that wasn't unique to that one man. General Nathanael Greene and many others, including the founders, said similar things. But just imagine that. Freedom has never lasted in the world. And yet the most daring part of your American founders was they hoped to establish a free society that could remain free forever. Now back off a minute and think of St. Augustine's famous remark that while many people look at countries in terms of things like the population and the grandeur of their cities and so on, the real thing to understand a country is what Augustine called their loved things held in common. What is it that a nation loves supremely? If it's something excellent, that nation is probably noble. And if that thing that they love supremely is in great condition, that nation must be in good health, and vice versa. If it's ignoble, or a noble thing is in poor condition, the nation is in trouble. And surely there's no question that America's loved thing held in common is freedom. Now I want to unpack that, but just suggest today that the solution the framers had, either through ignorance or deliberately turning away, modern Americans have abandoned completely. And the question is, have we got a better system of knowing how freedom can last forever? And if so, what is it? Because many of the stated ones or the unspoken ones, half-stated, are really thoroughly inadequate. And if you look at America today, one of the deepest crises, very obvious to outsiders, is the crisis of American freedom. Particularly your generation has a view of freedom that's 180 degrees different from the framers and is frankly not sustainable. So that's what we're talking about. But first, build up the picture as the framers saw their challenge and move slowly towards our own day. First, consider very simply the three tasks that the framers saw they were about. They were quite simply, they saw that to establish a free society, they had to win freedom, order freedom, and sustain freedom. Very obvious to say. Winning freedom is the revolution, 1776, and they did it. But so also did the French. So also did the Russians. So also did the Chinese. That is not very rare in human history. The second task was ordering freedom, not the revolution, but the Constitution. That took longer and in many ways much, much more thought. And the French did not do it, and nor did the Russians, and nor did the Chinese. In fact, their revolutions, without ordering freedom, spiraled down to demonic tyranny that was worse than the forms of tyranny that they replaced. The genius of the American framers, they won freedom and they ordered freedom. But that wasn't the end of it. And the third part is often forgotten today. They talked of sustaining freedom or perpetuating freedom. You remember the famous reply of Ben Franklin when he came out of the Constitutional Convention, which of course had been secret. And Mrs. Powell came up to him, "Mr. Franklin, what have you achieved?" And his immortal answer, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And many of the framers talked about sustaining freedom and perpetuating freedom. Some of the last words of James Madison were on that. Or you think of the young Lincoln, only a few years older than many of you, 28, newly arrived in Springfield, Illinois. And when they asked him what he wanted to speak on at the Lyceum that evening, he chose the topic, the perpetuation of our institutions. How are we doing 50 years on from the revolution? Now, of course, the revolution and winning freedom is a matter of a year or two. Ordering freedom took a lot longer. But sustaining freedom is the work not just of decades, but centuries. In other words, it's your task today. And yet today, when America above all should be thinking of it, because there's only one final stage after dominance, which is always decline, this is a time when it should be a topic on everyone's minds, but it's hardly on anybody's minds. Secondly, think of the framers' understanding of the menaces to sustaining freedom. We rightly think of them as revolutionary, and they were. But they were also rooted. They used history to try and defy history. And you can see how they ransacked the classics, the Greek and the Roman classics, to understand the classical understanding of why freedom never lasted. And the whole system was built to overcome that. Now, there were three main reasons you can see why the classical writers saw that freedom never lasts, and no regime lasted. The first was one the framers didn't bother about: an external menace. A nation's in trouble if it suddenly finds itself with a more vigilant, better armed, larger force against it, and so on. They didn't bother about that particularly because, coming from a small protected island, most of them, England, landing on a large protected continent, the United States, with two great oceans as buffers, external menaces were not their greatest threat. And you can see how often they discount that. Abraham Lincoln, in the same speech I mentioned, he pooh-poohs the idea of a transatlantic Bonaparte, as he calls it, putting his foot down in the cornfields of Ohio. The idea of an external menace was not their number one challenge. Of course, today, intercontinental ballistic missiles, 9/11, and we know, well, we have to take external threats equally seriously. But we don't take so seriously the other two which they did take seriously. The second menace was what Polybius, the Greek historian, calls a corruption of customs. Now, Polybius says in his histories, what's decisive for any nation, country, regime is its fundamental constitution. Reading that single sentence, many Americans go to sleep. Yours is the oldest, surviving, greatest constitution. We've got it, all is well. But that's not what Polybius says. Polybius says, yes, the Constitution is decisive, but it rests in a bedding of customs, of moral values, of customs, of standards, of traditions. And if you have a corruption of customs, eventually you will have a subversion of even the best constitution, and freedom and the regime will not last. Now that surely is very close where we are today. The third menace the framers read about in the classics was, in one word, time, the passing of time. We would add as Christians, the presence of sin and the passing of time. So this too shall pass. Nothing in the fallen world lasts forever. Interestingly, the year that the Constitution was passed was the same year that Edward Gibbon wrote the last volume of his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And in the last chapter, he says, why did Rome fall? And his first answer, the injuries of time. Lincoln, as a 28-year-old, in that same speech, he speaks of the silent artilleries of time doing damage to the walls, and so on. A 28-year-old with a vivid sense of passing time and nothing lasting forever. And of course, later, his famous parable about the wise man, searching for the truth that will be true in all times and all places, and coming back, this too shall pass. How many of your generation have that sort of sense of the transience of everything in life and the passing? Anyway, the framers were very clear of that. So the whole American system was created to overcome those menaces and, as I said, create a free society that could remain free forever. Now, thirdly, let me break in from the vantage point of later and earlier history and speak about the paradox of freedom. Many people think that freedom is freedom is freedom, like a rose is a rose is a rose. In other words, a thing is what it is, and so on. Not with freedom. There are many challenges to freedom, but underlying it is a profound conundrum. The greatest enemy to freedom is freedom. And that's the deepest reason freedom never lasts. Now, you could unpack that in various dimensions. Historically, free societies have been rare and fleeting. It's said that if you put the whole clock of human civilization compressed into 1 hour, free societies would only come in the last 2 or 3 minutes, and even then, relatively rare. The second part of the conundrum is political. As the great European thinkers like Montesquieu and Alexis de Tocqueville pointed out, freedom doesn't just require structures like the Constitution. it also requires the spirit of freedom, the structures of freedom, the spirit of freedom. And while the structures may last for a long time, the spirit of freedom has to be renewed from generation to generation, what Alexis de Tocqueville called the habits of the heart. And you can have the best structures, and eventually, without the right spirit, freedom's gone. But the deepest part of the conundrum of freedom is moral or spiritual. There is only one type of restraint that is appropriate to freedom, and that is self-restraint. And yet self-restraint is precisely what's first undermined when freedom becomes really free. And so there's a profound restlessness at the heart of free societies. We would say as Christians, restlessness is anyway because of sin. And for those three reasons, historical, political, and spiritual and moral, freedom never lasts, and freedom always becomes the greatest enemy of freedom. But back to the framers. Fourthly, how did the framers see that they could build in antidotes to the fact that freedom didn't last? They didn't give any word, any phrase, term, name, label for their solution. Tocqueville calls it the habits of the heart. My own name for it is the golden triangle of freedom. But you can see it throughout all the framers without any exception. The more liberal ones like Jefferson, the more conservative ones like George Mason, and many others in the middle. It is everywhere. In fact, it's so obvious, one of the great historians says, it's like the 800-pound gorilla in the room, so obvious that no one mentions it, and certainly today talks about it. What is the golden triangle of freedom? Put it simply, the framers say in many ways, freedom requires virtue, virtue requires faith of some sort, and faith of any sort requires freedom. And like the recycling triangle, it goes round and round ad infinitum. Freedom requires virtue, which requires faith, which requires freedom, which requires virtue, and so on, and so on, and so on. And you can see that in all the framers. John Adams, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. And he talks of the place, for example, of character and virtue. Now you can immediately see how different we are today. When President Clinton was impeached a few years ago, there was that famous letter to the New York Times and the Washington Post from various academics saying, almost, who cares about the character of the president? He could have the morals of an alley cat. What mattered was not character, but competence, the modern way of saying it. Now, both history and the framers would say something very, very different, that the character of presidents is always decisive, and the framers are indubitably clear about that. They loved words like inalienable, indefeasible, and all these sort of words. And there's one place where Adams piles up about 3 or 4 of them in a row, and he's not describing freedom or rights. He's describing the people's right to know the character of their leader. Freedom requires virtue. Virtue requires faith of some sort. They never said the Christian faith, although most of them admitted, for civic reasons, it was the best, as several of them put it. But faith of some sort, and the framers are embarrassing today because while they allow freedom of conscience for atheists, beyond any question, they were openly skeptical of a society of atheists. And Adams, once again, speaking of those who believed that the world would have, as he puts it, no father, actually has an uncanny description of where we are now in our postmodern era. But if you think, virtue of any sort, what is the content of virtue? You can't just say virtue, values, as Americans do today. You've got to say what virtues, what values, what are we talking about? As soon as you do, you come down to teaching that's mostly rooted in faith. Not just the content, but what's the inspiration? Why be virtuous? Of course you can be good and an atheist. People made in the image of God, as we would say, are capable of being rejecting God and good at the same time, or whatever. But clearly, the deeper inspiration for virtue in all its forms is faith. And of course, the third thing, the sanctions for faith. What happens if you're not virtuous? There was nothing stronger in those days, of course, than the notion of hell, and nothing like that in the atheist view. And they were embarrassingly clear that a society of atheists would simply not survive. But the third leg of the triangle is, of course, the most radical. And many Americans think checks and balances, separation of powers. No. Switzerland and other countries had that long before the United States. The most unique, it can only just be unique, the most revolutionary, the most distinctive, the absolutely unique part of the American Constitution is the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment, the total disestablishment of religion. And of course, religion flourishes not despite disestablishment, but because of it, because it's now not coerced, it is voluntary. So there's that antidote that the framers saw, and if that was practiced, maybe freedom could last. Move on once more, fifthly, to seeing some of the factors that have completely undermined that. Take some of the earlier factors. I would start with the privatization of faith. The faith that the framers referred to was clearly a faith that was integrated with the whole of life and was a powerful cultural force in society and not just personally engaging. Now, I start there because many Americans today, like a book a few years ago, talk of the stealing of America, as if some nasty liberals have stolen it from us or whatever. Let's remember the privatization of faith, which made faith inadequate to do the job that the framers had in mind, let alone what our Lord called us to, happened long before there were any significant opposition to us or to the faith in this country. It happened way back in the early times of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. The second great factor changing all this is what's called in one word proceduralism. Usually associated with John Rawls at Harvard, the idea that faith, character, and virtue are inviolably private. The public square is inviolably secular. It's a neutral arena of competing interests where faith and character and virtue are irrelevant. We're talking about economic issues, legal issues, technical issues, rational issues, not moral and spiritual issues. And for the last generation, that's been a very powerful thought in most of academia and in much of American public life with educated people. The third factor is the most recent and the most radical, postmodernism. In other words, the framers were really about power. And all that fancy stuff in the Declaration of Independence was really fancy stuff covering the real agenda of tidewater plantation owners repressing their slaves. In other words, throw the whole thing out, baby, bathwater, and all. Now move on down to what I call the contemporary menaces to freedom. There are certain things at work in American society now which make the framers' views impossible. The first is a significant alienation of many leaders. With some, it's a matter of ignorance. With some, it's a matter of deliberate disagreement. But with many of America's educated elites, the framers' solutions have gone. You can trace it back to the progressives, and even a president like Woodrow Wilson dismissing much of the framers and saying we've got beyond all those sort of things today, and that's gathered pace in the 20th century. A second factor, equally practical, is a breakdown in the transmission of American values. If you think this country is always in the business of a double transmission, it has to hand it on in two ways in every generation, or the whole thing falls apart. The first transmission is from the older generation to the younger generation. Let me call that public education. And it's no secret that 50 years of the mediocrity of present education has completely lost any stress on civic education. The second transmission is immigration. And whether you call it the melting pot or the mosaic or the salad bowl or any of the politically correct terms, there's no question that one of the great things about this country was when people came to this country, they were taught and learned what it meant to be American. So there was a pluribus unum. And that isn't just America's motto, it's probably America's greatest achievement. But today, the unum has collapsed. And with all the discussion of immigration, control of borders, second language, economic this and that, I haven't heard a single national leader talk about civic education to those who come. The third of the contemporary menaces, to put in Polybius terms, is a corruption of customs. Now that's his term. Let me just take one simple example. In a way, the entire culture wars today is an example of the corruption of customs. Almost everything at stake in the present culture warring are things which before the 1960s would have been self-evident and accepted by almost all Americans, whether Republican or Democrat, left, right, or center. What's life? Is there such a thing as truth? What's a family? Does character matter in our leaders? These things would have been commonplace before then, and they're all up for stake now. But if you think of it, the deepest part of the culture warring today is freedom. Lincoln called the Civil War a freedom war. And many people are saying today the culture wars are the second freedom war. And without going much further, I would just say simply, rather than the sort of freedom the framers understood, in other words, a freedom that was negative and positive together. Do you know that discussion? Isaiah Berlin, the great Jewish philosopher at Oxford, whom I remember, he talked about negative freedom being freedom from colonial repression, freedom from chains, freedom from whatever it is. That's negative freedom. But negative freedom is only a preliminary freedom, a necessary freedom for the other part of freedom, which is positive freedom, freedom to be. And for that, you need truth and character and virtue. But if you look at American freedom today, not only on the liberal side, but also on the conservative side, it is almost all negative. Get the government off our backs. Get the government away from my body, or whatever it is. Almost entirely a libertarian negative freedom, which has never lasted, because it's only half a freedom and certainly is not sustainable today. And I suggest to you that your generation is working out a corrupt, unsustainable freedom that is absolutely disastrous for the renewal of this country. Now, let me draw it to conclusion. Does all that mean that I'm a pessimist and there's no hope? Not at all. Every Christian message has hope. But what is the hope here? When Lincoln, in Wisconsin on the hay wagon, raised these sort of questions in his election debate, and he talked about the sages coming back to the monarch with the line, "This too shall pass." Lincoln says, I'm not quoting exactly, but the gist of it, he says, "But let us yet hope that this is not quite true. That through our American cultivation of the land around us and the cultivation of our minds within us, we will be able to overcome that." Now, is that the best we can do? I don't think so. I'm intrigued by some of the framers' understanding of the parallels between themselves and the Jews and the Puritans earlier. And there are three parallels that are talked about, and the third one leads us down to the possibility of renewal. The first parallel was that they saw that what the Jews talked of as Exodus, Puritans talked of as conversion. And they talked of, in their secular political concerns as revolutionary founders, they talked of as revolution. In other words, each of those is a grand, liberating experience that is formative for a people. The second parallel comes closer. What the Jews talked of as covenant, the Puritans also talked of as covenant. And the framers consciously talked of as constitution. Because the Constitution is a secularized, nationalized form of the Puritan covenant from New England, which had come from the Reformation, which of course traces its roots back to the Old Testament scriptures. But it's the third one that has always intrigued me. What the Jews talked of as return, the Puritans talked of as revival or visitation or awakening. And even the framers had their version. George Mason, who was Anglican and Orthodox and more conservative, he talked about the necessity for a frequent recurrence to fundamental first principles. You had to keep going back to be replenished and renewed. Jefferson, who was much more liberal, talked about a revolution every 20 years because every new generation was a new people and they'd have to buy into it all over again. They realized there was a possibility of renewal, but certain things had to be done consciously and carefully, in both cases going back. Now here, incidentally, is something where the U.S. surely is close to the church. Have you ever thought that the two greatest movements of ideas in Western history were both movements of going back? The Renaissance, going back to the roots of classical learning, and the Reformation, going back to our Lord and the Scriptures. Both of them went back. And the church always needs to remember that it goes forward best by going back first. But in a similar way, so does America. And the idea that progress only or innovation only will pull America out of its present problems is utter fallacy. There are probably nothing in the present situation that couldn't be profoundly helped by going back to the best. The best, of course, the framers had some of the worst too, their treatment of race, their treatment of women, their treatment of Native Americans. But some of the best that they did needs to be learned again today, and there would be the possibility of renewal and return. Are you people of hope? What would such a return mean? I think among other things, we need to have, on the one hand, a renewal of civic education. There was a very simple idea behind that in the past. In a free society, everybody's born free. Not everybody is worthy of freedom, so you have to educate people to be worthy of freedom. It was called civic education or liberal education. Of course, the L word is under a cloud today, even in conservative circles, which is often stupid. Liberal is good in many ways. There needs to be a recovery of liberal civic education. There equally needs to be a reopening of the civic public square. And you can see even in this month, if we saw in the last administration the horror around the world, American presidents defending torture, and now we see American president denying freedom of conscience. Many people who loved human dignity and who loved religious liberty and freedom of conscience can hardly believe that it's American presidents who've taken stands that are so antithetical to part of the greatness of the American foundations. There needs to be a reformation, renewal of civic education, and a reopening of a civil public square, and a renewal of the understanding of what Roger Williams calls soul freedom, freedom of thought and conscience for people of all faiths. I've often ended, and I will today, with something that's always struck me from Alexis de Tocqueville. As you know, as Americans, those of you who are, I'm not, and many of the rest of you aren't, but as you know, he wrote his Democracy in America as a great tribute to American democracy. But he didn't write it for Americans. He wrote it for his fellow Frenchmen, hoping they'd learn the lesson. But while he was a grand admirer of the American Revolution, he was a strong, disappointed lover of the French Revolution. And much of his life, he compares and contrasts the fate of the two in all sorts of ways that are fascinating today. But towards the end of his life, he makes a very interesting little remark. He says, with a revolution, as with a novel, the hard part to invent is the ending. Now I say that to you. Your generation, you who are rising to adulthood in your 20s and 30s, you are described by futurists as the crunch generation, in the sense that many of the trends in our world today, in this new global era, are converging: economic, demographic, technological, environmental, nuclear, you name it. They're converging so that gigantic problems and questions are being raised for humankind. And if they're answered well in your lifetime, humankind can hope for sunnier sailing. But if they're not answered at all, or they're answered badly, humankind is in for extremely turbulent times. Your generation is the crunch generation, globally speaking. But equally, your generation of young Americans lives at an extraordinary time. We could say the same for the church, but I'm talking about America today. And what you do in this generation could be decisive for the sustaining of the freedom of the American Republic or not. God be with you.